AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson joining you here on a Tuesday afternoon. And right now we are joined by Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, as we're going to be talking about some of the stories that they have been working on over the past few days and weeks as we approach election season. Again, make sure you go to minnesotareformer.com for the best in Minnesota news and politics. And make sure if you really do value their election coverage to give them a donation over at minnesotareformer.com. All right, so what's on the docket today? We are going to be talking about HOAs, and specifically one management company at an HOA that has maybe gotten themselves in a little bit of hot water with some exorbitant assessments that they've been charging to homeowners for some questionable roof repairs at this property. We'll be talking about that. Plus, also Patrick's very fascinating and very deep dive column into something he wrote about a person named Janae Bates, who is a name you might be familiar with here on AM 950. Back when she was with Isaiah, we interviewed her a number of times. But she has an interesting story about the work she's doing right now and her unique story of marrying Dantes Hatcher, who is a man serving a prison sentence for the tragic death of his daughter's mother. We'll be talking about that, plus some thoughts on the election coming up in the next few weeks. So, Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off talking about HOAs, because we're going to dive into a story that's been raising a lot of serious questions about the transparency and accountability in homeowners associations, or HOAs. Residents of the villas at Pheasant Ridge in Otsego, Minnesota, are facing a hefty $18,000 assessment for roof replacements, which is an expense that's already led to at least one foreclosure on the property. Now, what's particularly alarming about this case is that the HOA board steered the roofing work to a contractor that's owned by the property management company, Gasson, leaving many of the homeowners wondering if this decision was truly in their best interest. So, Patrick, can you summarize some of the main concerns residents have about the HOA's decision to replace the roofs and the $18,000 assessment, and basically how this all played out? Because there are a lot of questions about how this assessment was brought forth with this $18,000 and specifically that company that is doing this roof replacement.
Right. Well, what happens is the HOA of this community, which is in Otsego, They changed their property manager. The property manager called Gasson. They come in and they start talking about replacing the roof almost immediately. They also changed the insurance carrier. And I think what you're seeing here is that these property managers who can be very savvy and shrewd, and then you're dealing with HOA boards, folks who are just volunteers. They don't necessarily know what's going on. And I think anybody who served on an HOA board would tell you it's just sort of an obligatory thing you do to try to help out. It's not something that you enjoy probably, and you're not an expert in these issues. So what happens is in July of 23, the HOA president signs an agreement to do this roof replacement. Strangely enough, he signed the document on July 6th, which is 7 days before the hailstorm, after which the property manager said, we got to get a new roof on here. So that looks kind of odd. And the other thing is that a number of people who live in the community talk to us, including a guy who got his own roofing company, who say they didn't need a new roof. This person actually went on the roof. He has experience with damaged roofs. He says there was no need for a new roof, and yet the HOA board, no doubt at the urging of the property manager, ordered up the new roof. And who got the work? A subsidiary of the property manager. So that doesn't look good either. And then there doesn't appear to have been any a real bidding process, a legitimate bidding process. And then when the residents, a couple of them, ask questions about all this, the property manager turns around and bills them for legal fees. They had their lawyers answer these questions, and they get socked with these legal fees. There's just one thing after another, and we are aware of definitely one person who he couldn't pay this $18,000. It turned out to be the deductible on the roof replacement. He couldn't pay the $18,000. He didn't have enough supplemental insurance to cover it, and so he goes into foreclosure. And we found another foreclosure that's in process, a similar amount, so that's almost certainly related to the roof replacement. So this looks like a very questionable set of circumstances that is having a real impact on people's ability to own a home. And from what we can tell, it's not clear that the property manager here have done anything illegal. So in other words, I think this is definitely an issue for the legislature to take up ASAP.
Yeah, and this is something that I think a lot of people can relate to because, as I understand, I think it's about 1.5 million people in Minnesotans, which is about like 30% of our population, maybe a little bit less than that, live on a property where they have an homeowners association. And as you were talking about, a lot of times nobody really wants to serve on those boards. I'm part of an HOA, and that's one of the things I definitely want to stay away from, even though I probably should get involved in that for this very reason that we're talking about right now, where you do get people that are on HOA boards that are very much volunteers. They're not doing it for any money, and they oftentimes do kind of turn things over to the judgment of the management company, and we can kind of see what happens when you let that run awry. So I do want to talk about some of these legal requirements. I know you were mentioning that for the most part, it appears this management company, Gasson, is largely in the clear. So it sounds like there really is no legal requirement for them to solicit competitive bids, and perhaps even more alarming, it's perfectly legal for them to charge fees to residents for even asking questions and then facing legal fees for having lawyers answer those questions. That all seems rather crazy that the management company and the HOA itself is able to do this and not really face any legal ramifications.
Right, and I'm curious as to who wrote these statutes and who was involved in influencing the writing of these statutes. And I suspect it was the developers and the property managers that control these communities. The HOA phenomenon is very common in the Sun Belt, and I feel like it's less so. You don't see much of it, as much of it in the Twin Cities, but I think it's an emerging, an increasing form of governance. It's a kind of privatized governance. And I think it's time for the legislature to really scrutinize some of these practices and make sure we're not seeing the abuse of power.
Well, now let's talk about the state legislature. Has there been any thoughts recently at the state legislature from members on how they might want to reform this? Has there been any talk, or what sorts of changes might we see when it comes to HOA reform? Because as you said, this is something that we're only going to see more of in Minnesota in the coming years.
Yeah, there is a task force that's been set up. I have concerns that the task force is controlled by people in the industry, or not controlled, but there's a heavy influence. There's a heavy industry influence. But I think this is going to be an issue that's bubbling up because it has a real impact on homeowners, and I think that legislators are probably paying more attention to this as it becomes much more common.
We'll encourage you to give this a read over at MinnesotaReformer.com, just talking about this real nightmare situation that homeowners are facing at this property in Otsego, Minnesota, because as more and more people become involved and become part of homeowners associations, these types of things can happen. So kind of a lesson to make sure you pay attention to your homeowners association, but then also read through what can happen, as I think you're absolutely right that we are in need of some reforms when it comes to laws and regulations around HOAs. Make sure you read more about that over at MinnesotaReformer.com. I want to move on now and talk about a column you wrote, Patrick, because your column was a very deep read about Janae Bates, who is a minister and co-director of the progressive religious group Faith in Minnesota. And she has a very unique story of marrying a person named Dantes Hatcher, who is a man that's serving a prison sentence for the tragic death of his daughter's mother. And really, your column explores some pretty profound questions about forgiveness, redemption, and really whether a person can be defined by the worst moment of their life. So, Patrick, can you summarize how Janae Bates got connected with Dantes and how their relationship blossomed? I mean, obviously, we don't have it's more. The story will require more time than we have time to talk about. But can you at least give us a summary of what happened with their relationship, because it's a really fascinating story.
Yeah, Janae Bates, who's an emerging leader in progressive politics here in Minnesota, she's originally from Ohio, and she and Dantes Hatcher were kind of high school sweethearts. They wound up going their separate ways. She went on to college and a Fulbright fellowship, and then became an ordained minister and wound up here. He, on the other hand, he grew up really kind of in a really tough environment of the crack epidemic of the early 90s in Cleveland, foster homes and violence in the home and that kind of thing. And he wound up with a woman who apparently was a wonderful person, but at the time he was really struggling with drugs and alcohol. He he wound up mistakenly, he says, firing a gun, hit her, killed her, and he went to prison for 20 years after this incident in 2005. Around 2015 or so, that's when Janae came here, and sometime after that, she got this letter from him wanting to reconnect. For her, it was just an opportunity to provide Christian service, essentially, to someone who's in prison. And so that's how it started. They wound up having one 15-minute phone call every week for 4 years. And then he indicated to her through some poetry that he had romantic feelings. And from there, it kind of blossomed. And he's set to get out of prison next year. But the most important part here is that the work that he's tried to do to seek forgiveness and restoration with his daughter, who was a 3-week-old baby when the killing happened, also with the mother of the deceased and the grandparents of the deceased, and really what we can take from that as we try to do criminal justice reform, because when we talk about criminal justice reform, I think we often think of the easy cases, the nonviolent cases in which we think we ought to release people from prisons and reduce our incarceration rate. But the reality is that a majority of people serving in state prisons around the country have committed some kind of a violent offense. And so if we're going to really reduce incarceration rates, we need to think about those people who are in for a violent offense and figure out how to make them less violent, to make the prison system a place that reduces violence rather than what it does now, which is the opposite. So really important questions here about criminal justice reform through the lens of this really remarkable story of Janae Bates, who was married to a man in prison. And I really enjoyed getting to know everybody involved and felt good about humanity for a day or so, despite all of the darkness of the story itself.
Absolutely, and I do want to highlight one aspect of the column that you talked about, and that is the Danielle Project. I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about that, because it's such a kind of a cool aspect, because it's Hatcher and Danielle Boone's family are working together, particularly Danielle Boone's grandparents, who are the grandparents of the deceased, working with Hatcher on the Danielle Project. So I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about this and what he's kind of helped spearhead while in prison.
Yeah, the Jenkins, they are Danielle Boone's grandparents, and they raised her, and so that no one was closer to her than the Jenkins, and yet they accepted Dantes when he reached out to ask for forgiveness, and over the course of years they got there. And their position was actually very pragmatic. It was that simply they knew that the daughter would eventually meet Dantes, and they wanted their great granddaughter, I should say, for that to be a positive experience, and so they wanted Dantes to be an evolved man. And so Mrs. Jenkins began this process of really working with Dantes, and together they came up with a program that would try to reduce domestic violence and violence overall. And he designed this course, which this prison in Ohio allowed him to teach to other inmates, and 200 inmates went through the course. And so it's an example of somebody, he shot the mother of his child in the face. Not somebody you would expect to have a positive influence on the world, and yet 20 years later, here he is. He's helped hopefully 200 men to think through issues in a more constructive way and reduce violence, especially against women.
We'll encourage you to check out that column over at MinnesotaReformer.com. MinnesotaReformer.com. It's a great story telling us about Janae Bates and her very unique relationship with Dantes Hatcher. Again, at MinnesotaReformer.com. And final thing I wanted to touch on with you here, Patrick, is what's happening at least on in the political and election scene, at least nationally right now. Of course, we have the usual Democratic bedwetting at the national scene as to whether they'll be able to hold the Senate and flip the House, while Republicans are at least feeling a little more bullish on the national level right now. How much there is to that remains to be seen, whether that's just part of the usual fluctuations we see of the campaign cycle. But I'm at least curious how people are feeling, at least locally in Minnesota, with our races for the state legislature. Are you getting any indication from either of the parties about how they're feeling, how things are going right now?
I think that the Democrats are in the driver's seat. They have more money, better organization. It's kind of a Groundhog Day thing, because it's no different than past cycles. They have Tim Walz at the top of the ticket, so certainly that should make sure the Democratic base turns out. You have a U.S. Senate race. It's not really a race at all. So that's probably not great for Republicans here either. I think the key number here will be about 4 points. If the Democrats, if Harris and Walz win Minnesota by 4 points or so, anything above that, I think you're going to see Democratic control of the legislature. If it's narrower than that, I think it's much more of a toss-up. So I think that the presidential election is a 50-50 at this point. I think that narrowly Democrats will keep the legislature here, but I don't think it's a guarantee at all. So I think the work of the ground game is going to be pretty important here.
And I think your estimation of about a 4 percentage point victory for Harris Walz in Minnesota is a pretty good estimate for what it would take for DFLers to control the state legislature, since that's about how much they They won the election back in 2020 with Joe Biden, and lo and behold, Democrats were able to hold control of the state house. So still expected to be very close, but I kind of agree that 4 percentage point mark is probably going to be the key number when it comes to the presidential election in Minnesota, when it comes to telling us what could happen at the legislature. We have been speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Make sure you go to minnesotareformer.com for the best in Minnesota news and politics, and make sure you give them a donation, too, to continue the great work they do over at minnesotareformer.com. As always, Patrick, thanks for coming on the show today.
Appreciate it, Brad.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.